While the world has its eyes fixed on the 2026 World Cup, while millions of people follow every match in Mexico, Canada, and the United States, there is a question almost nobody has asked, and that deserves an answer. How many times has cinema tried to tell the story of the FIFA World Cup? Not documentaries, not news reports, not archive footage. Fiction films with actors, with scripts, with drama invented or semi-invented around the greatest sporting spectacle on the planet. The answer will surprise you because there are few of them, they are strange, and some hide stories behind the camera as fascinating as what happened on the pitch. Today we are going to go through all of them, from the very first World Cup in history in 1930 to the same week that the tournament we are living through right now kicked off. We start at the beginning with the very first of them all, with the World Cup that nobody in Europe deigned to take seriously. It is 1930, and the recently created FIFA has decided to hold the first World Cup in Uruguay, the reigning Olympic football champion. The problem is that European teams have to cross the Atlantic by ship, a journey of weeks in the middle of the Great Depression. Most European federations declined the invitation. Only 4 teams from the old continent made the trip, and among them was Yugoslavia, a country that had only just come into existence as such, with players who in many cases had never left their villages. That apparently minor story became the basis for one of the most beloved films in Balkan cinema. Montevideo, Taste of a Dream was directed in 2010 by Dragan Bjelogrlic, and in Serbia something extraordinary happened. It became the highest-grossing film in the history of the country, and of the entire Balkan region. Not of that year, of all time. A record that took years to break, achieved with a story that blends comedy, romance, and sporting epic in perfect proportions. The plot follows a group of Yugoslav footballers who literally embark on a ship bound for Uruguay, traveling weeks in third class with scarce resources, most of them playing their first real international match. And yet, those humble men arrived in Montevideo, and Yugoslavia finished third in that first World Cup. They did not win, but nobody had picked them to win, and cinema knew how to see in that story the exact material from which great sports films are made. The production was so successful that it generated a sequel in 2014 and years later a television series. And when Serbia's committee chose their Oscar candidate, they chose this film, although it did not make the final shortlist. The detail that says more than anything else: in a country of 7 million people, everyone who could went to see this film. Which means that football and cinema, when they speak the same language, need no Hollywood star whatsoever. If we had to choose the most improbable result in the entire history of the World Cup, the one no computer would have predicted, the one no bookmaker would have accepted as possible, the answer would probably be the match of June 29th, 1950, United States versus England in Brazil, first round of the tournament. The result: United States 1, England 0, a goal from Joe Gaetjens in the 37th minute, and the most absolute silence in the history of English football. To understand the weight of that defeat, you have to understand the context. England had spent decades refusing to participate in World Cups, convinced that football was their invention and that they had nothing to prove to anyone. It was the first time the English national team had competed in a World Cup. Newspapers across the world ran the result as if it were a typographical error. The BBC took hours to confirm it. Many in England believed it was a joke. And the team that had beaten them was made up of players who for the most part had other jobs, who had traveled to Brazil with nobody betting a cent on them, with minimal preparation, and who returned home practically in anonymity. The Game of Their Lives, made in 2005, recovers that story with a sober and honest tone without unnecessary artifice. The cast has no major stars, which works in the film's favor because the real protagonist is the feat itself. The direction of David Anspaugh, the same man who decades earlier had made Hoosiers and Rudy, 2 of the best sports films in Hollywood history, applies the same formula here. Ordinary people, extraordinary circumstances, and sport as a mirror for something far deeper than a scoreline. The film had no great commercial run, and today it is almost impossible to find. But whoever watches it understands why the match of June 29, 1950, remains, decades later, the most uncomfortable result in the history of English football. There are World Cups won with football and World Cups won with history. The 1954 Switzerland World Cup belongs to the second category, at least for Germany. The German team arrived at that tournament divided, like the country itself, which had spent less than 10 years trying to rebuild on the ruins of the Second World War. Hungary were the undisputed favorites, the team of Puskás and Kocsis, the side that had beaten everyone and that nobody in Europe believed could be defeated. In the group stage, Hungary crushed Germany 8-3. In the final, 4 weeks later, Germany won 3-2. The Miracle of Bern entered forever into the vocabulary of a country that desperately needed to believe in something. Sönke Wortmann made in 2003 a film that is not exactly a sports film. It is a film about Germany. About a boy waiting for his father's return, a prisoner of war in the Soviet Union since the end of the conflict almost a decade later. About a family trying to put itself back together without understanding each other. And about football as the thread that ties all of that together, as a narrative pretext for talking about a nation that needed to look at itself in the mirror and did not know what it was going to find. The German national team is the backdrop, not the protagonist. But the Bern final, filmed with exceptional energy and precision, is one of the finest recreations of a football match that European cinema has ever produced. The film was an absolute phenomenon in Germany, where it grossed more than 20 million euros, making it one of the highest-grossing German films in recent history. It was Germany's official Oscar submission that year. And still today, when people talk about football as a metaphor for the identity of a people, The Miracle of Bern appears on any serious list of films that have known how to use sport to talk about something infinitely greater than a trophy. And then we arrive at the film that is, right now, in June 2026, while the World Cup is in full swing, the strangest and most current story on this list. Because Mexico '86 is not just a film about a past World Cup, it is a film about how a country managed to host a World Cup through a combination of audacity, improvisation, and political maneuvering that FIFA would have preferred nobody ever filmed. The real story begins in 1982. Colombia had been chosen to host the 1986 World Cup, but the Colombian president withdrew from the organization due to domestic economic and political problems. FIFA was left without a host 4 years before the tournament, and then Mexico, which had already hosted the competition in 1970, put forward a candidacy that nobody expected, competing against the United States and Canada, countries with more infrastructure, more money, and fewer precedents involving earthquakes. Mexico won the vote in Stockholm on May 20th, 1983 unanimously. How they managed it exactly is what Gabriel Ripstein's film does not fully explain, but instead suggests, insinuates, and leaves hanging in the air with an intelligence that annoyed several people who were actually there. Diego Luna plays Martín de la Torre, a fictional character inspired by Rafael del Castillo, president of the Mexican Football Federation during those years, who died just a few weeks before the film's release, in March 2026. Daniel Jimenez Cacho plays Emilio Azcárraga Milmo, the man the film itself describes literally as the most powerful man in Mexico. The result is a dark comedy, ironic and sharp, which Netflix released on June 5th, 2026, exactly 6 days before the current World Cup kicked off at the Estadio Azteca. The timing was no accident, it was a statement. And Hugo Sanchez, whose figure appears in the film and who was not consulted during production, made clear from the very first day that he considered much of what the film says about him to be, in his own words, lies. Diego Luna responded at the film's premiere that the movie does not try to be a documentary, that it begins by saying some things are true and some are not, and that the viewer is free to find the difference. That exactly is what makes Mexico '86 interesting. And we finish where perhaps nobody would expect to finish. Not with a historical epic or a political satire, but with the biggest cinematic failure on this list and probably the most ironic of all. The trilogy that sank precisely when it reached the biggest stage of all. Goal was in 2005 a modest and entertaining film about Santiago Muñez, a young man of Mexican origin fighting to make it as a professional footballer in England. It had good energy, a reasonable budget, and enough success to justify a second installment. Goal. 2 followed the protagonist's career at Real Madrid with appearances from Beckham, Raul, Zidane, and Ronaldo, which turned the film into something closer to a promotional event than a piece of cinema. And then came Goal 3, Taking on the World, where Santiago Muñoz, Liam Adams, and Charlie Braithwaite compete in nothing less than the 2006 World Cup in Germany, the most ambitious setting in the trilogy, the actual World Cup as backdrop. The dream of any sports franchise. The result was a disaster. The third installment did not even reach cinemas. It was released directly in home format, on DVD and Blu-ray in the United Kingdom, with a devastating critical reception and a fan reaction that can be summed up in one question that circulated on forums at the time. How is it possible that the film about the World Cup is worse than the 2 before it, which had no World Cup at all? The most honest answer is that the trilogy had exhausted its budget and its energy in the first 2 chapters, and the third arrived with whatever was left. The grand setting, the Football World Championship, ended up being the empty wrapper of a story that had nothing left to say. There is something profoundly cinematic about that. The 2006 Germany World Cup, which in reality produced historic moments like Zidane's headbutt on Materazzi in the final, generated in fiction the most forgotten film of a franchise that began with promise and ended up filed away. Sometimes cinema and football are more alike than they seem, and both remind you that reaching the final guarantees absolutely nothing. 5 films, 5 World Cups, 5 different ways of understanding that the greatest spectacle in world sport has generated, in almost 100 years of cinema history, far fewer works of fiction than you might expect. And those that do exist, almost without exception, say more about the country that made them than about the tournament they portray. Because football, when cinema films it well, is never just football. It is Yugoslavia sailing for 3 weeks into the unknown. It is Germany trying to recognize itself after a war. It is Mexico convincing FIFA with something nobody has ever fully been willing to confirm. It is the difference between what happened on the pitch and what stayed off camera, which is always the most interesting thing. If you know of any other fiction film based on a World Cup that we might have missed, leave it in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, you know what to do.